Once upon a time, a very long time ago, so 1946, Boston Garden owner Walter Brown realized that many ice hockey rinks were not being used most nights, and there wasn't any professional basketball. So what did he do, you ask? Probably made one of the best decisions for American entertainment history and created the Basketball Association of America, which is known as the NBA today. Originally, the league was only made up of 11 teams. Almost all of these teams from nearly 80 years ago have either relocated or discontinued, all except two historic teams, the Boston Celtics and the New York Knicks. The Boston Celtics, ever since this date, have become one of the most successful franchises in NBA history, winning 17 championships and countless finals and conference finals appearances. Yeah, Jason Tatum is really helping with those last two categories. But the Knicks, though, despite being the birthplace of the NBA, despite playing in the very first NBA game, despite being the biggest market in the NBA, despite being a professional team for 76 years, more than 3/4 of a century, only have two measly rings to show for it. They haven't won a championship in over 50 years, for Christ's sake. So it really brings up the question, how has a team that's been around this long seen this little of success? What's really happened, or should I say, what hasn't happened between 1973 and 2023 that's prevented them from winning even just one championship? Now, before we start here, I'm not asking you to like or subscribe, but what I will ask of you is to personally send this video to Stephen A. Smith and force him to watch every last second of it.
As the executive of the New York Knicks was to sign Lamar Odom, who was on crack.
Or send this to any Knicks fan you know that almost had a stroke when they saw the Knicks make it past the first round of the postseason last year.
Hey, yo, LeBron, when we see you in the finals, bring that same energy.
Anyways, let's start the video. The date is November 1st, 1946, the day the NBA officially started. The very first game was the Toronto Huskies hosting the New York Knickerbockers. The Huskies won this game with a tight score of 68-66. But little did the Knicks know, this game would be the start of a very frustrating and underwhelming future. But despite this loss, the Knicks were actually a solid team in the beginnings of the NBA. The New York Knicks in the late 40s into the mid 50s were actually a very decent team, led by forward Harry Gallatin, who averaged about 15 boards and 14 points in his prime. Mind you, this was actually really good considering the average points per game in the league was under 80 per team, and the league average field goal percentage was under 40%. He was a baller back in the day. Anyways, with the likes of Gallatin, the Knicks made the playoffs 10 straight seasons, and even got as far as 3 finals appearances in a row from 1951 to 1953. But sadly, no championships under Gallatin's reign. After this, the Knicks went on a 10-year drought from 1957 to 1966, where they only had one playoff appearance and a combined 292 and 478 record. That's a 37% win percentage. The Bill and Wilt era for Knicks fans was a tough time, but luckily the Knicks were going through a solid rebuild at the time and were stacking up on some really important pieces. The Knicks in 1964 drafted future star big man Willis Reed, who will be very important shortly. During the beginning of the 1965 and 66 season, the Knicks traded away 3 decent role players in Jim Barnes, Johnny Egan, and Johnny Green to the Baltimore Bullets for star big man Walt Bellamy. This is exactly what the Knicks needed to win. After that, the Knicks traded for Dick Barnett, who was a really good scorer back in the day, and drafted their star point guard Walt Frazier. Eventually, they traded away an aging Walt Bellamy for forward Dave DeBusschere, who was also a key piece for the Knicks. All of these roster changes and rebuilding years paid off for the Knicks because in 1970, the Knicks finally won their very first NBA championship. They beat the Los Angeles Lakers in 7 games. Willis Reed was the main motor for this team, averaging 23 and 13 a game in the playoffs and winning the Finals MVP. This was followed by 2 playoff exits in the next 2 years, but the Knicks bounced back because in 1973, the Knicks won the Finals once again. They virtually had the same roster with Walt Frazier, Willis Reed, Dave DeBusschere, and Dick Barnett, with additions of Earl Monroe and Jerry Lucas. But this time, it was Walt Frazier who was leading this team. Despite him putting up 22 points, 7 rebounds, and 6 assists in the playoffs, it was Willis Reed who averaged only 12 and 7 a game who was crowned the Finals MVP. But nonetheless, it was a championship for New York, and unfortunately the most recent championship. During the next 12 years was another dark time for the Knicks. The championship winning core was aging, and the team was going through a lot of roster changes during this time. Bernard King, Bob McAdoo, and Bill Cartwright were some of the Knicks' best players during these struggling years. The team from 1976 to 1987 had a record of 436 and 548, giving them a 44% win rate. They had a couple of playoff appearances, but it was nothing serious. However, just like the previous struggling times of New York, there was something to look forward to, because during the 1985 draft, the Knicks, by the grace of God, aka David Stern rigging the draft, landed the number 1 pick, but that's a story for another video. Anyways, who they were going to draft was already a foregone conclusion. It was star big man prospect Patrick Ewing, and Patrick Ewing was that dude right away in the league. Ewing in his first season averaged 20 points, 9 boards, and 2 blocks, and was selected to the All-Star game as a rookie. You can probably understand the hype around this dude now. But despite Ewing's great numbers in the first season, and even his second season, the Knicks still sucked. They were dealing with injuries to their key players like Cartwright and King, and were making a lot of roster changes to accommodate Ewing. It wasn't until Ewing's 4th year in the league, 1989, where the Knicks actually saw some real success. In 1989, the Knicks had a very impressive record of 52-30, giving them the 3 seed. They took care of the 6-seeded 76ers with Charles Barkley in a 3-game sweep, but then in the second round, the Knicks lost to the Bulls in 6 games. And unfortunately for Patrick Ewing and the Knicks during this era, they ran into the dominance of the GOAT of basketball. Yes, he is. And the bad boy Pistons, because in 1990, the Knicks lost to the Pistons in the second round and lost to the MJ Bulls the next 3 years. The Knicks tried to spice up the roster in the early 90s with additions of big man Charles Oakley and sharpshooter Kiki Vandeweghe and guard John Starks, but it didn't work. But wait, there was great news coming for New York though. Michael Jordan was retiring from the league to play baseball. This opened up the East completely for a new team to dominate, and the Knicks took full advantage of this, because in the 1994 season, the New York Knicks made it out of the Eastern Conference into the finals. But unfortunately, they lost to the Houston Rockets in 7 games, where Hakeem locked up Patrick Ewing, if we're going to be honest. After this in the late 90s, the Knicks had a series of early playoff exits, despite having great regular season records. They also added players like Derek Harper, Allen Houston, Larry Johnson, and Latrell Sprewell around Ewing. It wasn't until 1999, during the 50-game lockout season, where the Knicks made the finals once again. They were facing off against the San Antonio Spurs, led by second-year star Tim Duncan. This was the Knicks' chance to finally get another ring after 25 plus years. This was probably Patrick Ewing's last chance to get a ring, being 36 years old. But you already know what happened. The Knicks lost in 5 games to the Spurs, and honestly, this was the last bright spot for the Patrick Ewing-led Knicks. Ewing retired a season after that, and everything went terrible for the Knicks. Some of the biggest problems for the Knicks during the Patrick Ewing days was, first off, a lack of a second superstar. The Knicks tried to do everything in their power to put a second star around Ewing. They tried with Oakley, Starks, Kiki, Derek Harper, Larry Johnson, Allen Houston, but none of these guys proved that they were star-level material. Another big problem that plagued the Knicks with Ewing was a lack of offense. The Knicks throughout nearly all of the 90s were known as one of the best defensive teams in the game. They routinely placed within the top 5 in defensive rating year in and year out, but they struggled to find any substantial offense besides Ewing. Ever since the days of Ewing, the Knicks' success has been laughable. From a 9-year span of 2002 to 2010, the New York Knicks were terrible, and I mean absolutely horrible. During this stretch, they never had a winning record in any of these 9 seasons. They had 1 playoff appearance in 2004 with a record of 39-43, but got spanked by the New Jersey Nets in a sweep. They had a combined record of 279-541, putting them at a measly 34% win rate. That's like saying they had 28 wins on average per season. During this time, some of the key contributors from the Ewing era were aging. Guys like Larry Johnson, Allen Houston, and Latrell Sprewell. The Knicks tried things with Stephon Marbury, David Lee, Jamal Crawford, Al Harrington, and Zach Randolph, just to name a few players. But nothing seemed to work. It wasn't until the superstar wing from the Nuggets, Carmelo Anthony, wanted to join ship, where the Knicks saw any real improvements. After countless early playoff exits from Anthony in Denver, he was looking to get out of there and start fresh with a new team. And what better place to go than the team that hadn't put up a winning record for almost a decade, am I right? Melo forced a trade to New York midway through the 2011 season, which forced the Knicks to give away a lot of their young and developing talent. This absolutely huge trade includes New York sending Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari, Timothy Mozgov, a first-round pick, and 2 second-round picks in exchange for Carmelo Anthony and Chauncey Billups, and a few other role players. The Knicks had to give up 3 young crucial pieces for Melo, 2 of which were putting up 15 points or more per game most of the time. The Knicks really went all in for Melo. This is what they needed to do. Go all in for a superstar that could hopefully bring them a title. The Knicks in 2011 finished with a record of 42-40, giving them the 6th seed in the East, but they got swept in the first round against the Celtics. In 2012, it was a lockout season, so the Knicks had a final record of 36-30. The Knicks acquired big man Tyson Chandler in a 3-way deal, which significantly helped them, but the Knicks in 2012 unfortunately lost in the first round once again. They lost 4-1 against the Miami Heat, who later won the NBA championship. In 2013, the Knicks had a really good regular season. They finished with a record of 54-28, putting them at the number 2 seed in the East. However, the Knicks once again fell short in the postseason, a really common trend we're seeing here. Amari Stoudemire was injured for most of the playoffs, which really hurt them. They lost the second round to Paul George and the Indiana Pacers. And what's really sad about this team is this is the farthest they've ever gotten in the playoffs. The farthest Carmelo Anthony got with the Knicks was the second round. Just like the Ewing-led Spurs had issues preventing them from winning a championship, the Melo-led Knicks definitely had their fair share of problems plaguing them. First off, the Knicks with Melo peaked right when the Heatles in Miami were a thing, so it would have been extremely hard to get past them. Even if they did beat the Pacers in 2013, I highly doubt they would have made it any further. We talked about the injuries they had that messed them up. The Knicks struggled to defend at a high enough level to contend for a championship. And similar to Ewing's teams, Carmelo Anthony's teams also lacked a second superstar, which is almost required to win an NBA championship. And ever since the Melo days, it's been depressing being a Knicks fan. I mean, that's why Stephen A. Smith has to take his anger out on Hot Take. I mean, I don't blame him though. The last time the Knicks won a championship was when the guy was in kindergarten. No, seriously, he would have been like 6 years old at that point. The Knicks from 2014 to 2023 have a combined 2 playoff appearances. Once in 2012, where they got mopped by the Hawks, where Trae Young became the villain of the league. And the other time was last year when the Knicks made their once-in-every-decade appearance past the first round. But then Jimmy Jordan had to remind them who they were. But let's really answer the original question here. How have the Knicks sucked for this long? I mean, seriously, 2 rings in 77 years? The biggest market in the NBA? The other biggest markets in the NBA with the Bulls, Celtics, and Lakers all have plenty of championships to show for themselves. But the Knicks, though? Let's talk about this. If we're being real honest here, the Knicks from 1946 all the way to about 2001 haven't really been the disappointment everyone makes them out to be. They got 2 rings with Willis Reed and Walt Frazier, then they went through a rebuilding time in the late 70s and early 80s, which pretty much every franchise has to do at some point. Well, except them. In the late 80s and all of the 90s, the Knicks were a really good ball club that made 2 finals appearances and countless conference semifinals appearances, which is miles better than the average franchise. Sure, maybe there was a few questionable trades or coaching decisions, but things just didn't bounce their way. It's really only from the time that Patrick Ewing retired until the current day where the Knicks rightfully deserve some criticism. And for all of you Knicks fans, I know exactly what you're thinking. This guy right here, Mr. James Dolan, the owner of the Knicks. He's been the owner since 1999, which kind of makes it easy to use him as the punching bag. Because I mean, just look at the success of the Knicks around him. Atrocious. Although the ownership is definitely at fault here, I think the problem goes even deeper than this. The Knicks from 1999 until the present day have had 10 GMs, and ever since the Knicks got rid of Jeff Van Gundy in 2002, the Knicks have had 13 different head coaches. As much as you want to blame Dolan, the management and coaching here also deserves some blame. All of this turnover with coaching and executives is almost a proven recipe for bad basketball. I think another overlooked reason why the Knicks have had a shitty past 20 years is questionable free agency decisions and relying on free agency for talent too heavily. Do you want to hear the most Knicks thing ever? In 2005, the Knicks probably made the worst decision for their organization in recent years. In 2005, James Dolan spent an insane, unreal $124 million on the Knicks roster. Back then, the salary cap was $46 million. The Knicks paid a mind-boggling $62.3 million on luxury tax. And you would think the Knicks would be one of the best teams in the league, spending all of this money, or at least just a playoff appearance would be nice. But remember, we're dealing with the Knicks here. So, in New York fashion, they went 23-59 with the worst record in the East. It's decisions like these that put the Knicks in a 2-decade-long handicap. Decisions like signing Jerome James for $30 million for 5 years, signing Eddie Curry to a multi-year deal, signing a washed Amari Stoudemire to $99 million for 5 years, Joakim Noah for 4 years and $72 million. Just to name a few examples of detrimental decisions to New York's team. What also hasn't worked out for them is what I like to call the Lakers rebuilding strategy, which is when a team, instead of rebuilding naturally through the draft like any other franchise, decide to instead sign expensive free agents and press their luck. Sometimes this goes great, but sometimes it goes terrible. But the Lakers are the only franchise in the NBA that can really pull off this strategy. The Knicks have tried this with players like Stephon Marbury, Jalen Rose, Steve Francis, Larry Hughes, Amari Stoudemire, and Carmelo Anthony as some prime examples. The problem with doing this is when you sign free agents instead of drafting them, it costs you an arm and a leg to get 2 superstars to truly contend for a title, and then you're left with no money to get depth around those stars. But when you draft your championship team, because you have quality talent for cheap, the only issue with this route is that it takes a lot longer. The Knicks have tried to play the free agency slot machine and have came up empty-handed for the last 20 years, and I doubt things will get much better with the Knicks anytime soon.